Monteith.
Well, it's good to be with you here. I want to tell you a story. It was written about 2,350 years ago, about 350 some years before Christ was born in Bethlehem. It was written by a Greek philosopher. And it was an allegory. It was a story of a group of men and women who had been taken captive and been taken into a gigantic cavern where they were kept for many years. And they were kept in chains so that their faces were towards the wall of the cave. And in the center of the cave, they're burned in eternal fire. The people were fixed so that all they could do was look at the wall of the cave and the shadows that were projected on the wall of the cave from the eternal fire. Now, at times, their captors, to amuse themselves, would project shadows on the wall of the cave. They might take the bust of a man or the face of a man and a statue and project it on the wall of the cave, and that would be the people's reality. At times there were humorous figures. At times there were frightening shadows. And all that they knew for the many years that they remained in the cavern are simply those dancing shadows projected upon the wall of the cave, and that became their reality. And then one day, one of their members broke loose from his chains, and he went outside and he saw truth. He saw the sun and the stars, the trees, and he came back into the cavern and broke his fellow captives free from their chains. And as they left the cavern, though, they approached, and the light blinded their eyes, and they turned back, because you see, for so long their reality had simply been dancing shadows projected upon the wall of the cave. And the question arises, could we be victims of something similar to what Plato wrote about? The story I've told you, it comes from Plato's Republic, and it's known as the parable of the cave. And I would like to suggest that perhaps, in many respects, we are victims of the same sort of situation. We really don't understand what is truly going on in the world today. It was 76 years ago when a man named Edward Bernays, and Edward Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he was the master propagandist. And he wrote a book. It is still available. It's called Propaganda. And he opens with these words: "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of." I'm going to repeat that again because it's the very essence of what I hope to teach you today. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. Could that be true? Well, Edward Bernays played an important part in creating the world we live in today. During the First World War, he was organized by something known as the U.S. Committee on Public Information that was able to convince the American people that we should go to war. And you remember all those wonderful slogans we had during the First World War? A war to make the world safe for democracy. Well, what does that remind you of today? The war to end all wars. Wouldn't it be wonderful, perhaps even to give your life fighting the war to end all wars? And because a small group of people control the media in those days. And those of you who have never seen our video, The Secrets of the Illuminati, ought to get that, because we go into the background of the degree of control that existed at that time. And they have that video in the back. We know that J.P. Morgan and his associates really bought up the majority of the major outlets, media outlets in America, to convince the American people we had to go to war. And the man who coordinated this whole movement was Edward Bernays. After the war, First World War, of course, he was hired by the American Tobacco Company. Now, when I went to medical school in the late 1940s, cancer of the lung in women was very uncommon. Cancer of the lung in men was common because, of course, men smoked, but women did not smoke. And Edward Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company, and lucky strike, convinced women they should smoke. They came up with all sorts of wonderful little gimmicks. One of them was reach for a smoke instead of a sweet. Isn't that sort of something you can remember? And, well, they succeeded. They were able to use the media to convince women they should smoke. And Edward Bernays succeeded wonderfully. Today, among women, the second most common cancer is cancer of the lung. And hundreds of thousands of women, if not millions of women, have or will die because of the success of Edward Bernays, who told us we are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes suggested, our ideas formed largely by men we have never heard of. In 1950, the U.S. Public Health Service hired Edward Bernays to sell the American people on water fluoridation. The promise of a perfect smile for children throughout all eternity. And what they were able to do was to turn an industrial poison into a panacea, and we'll talk more about water fluoridation later in this program. But it was a wonderful idea, and they were able to convince the doctors and the dentists and the American people that water fluoridation was the panacea that was going to lead us all to perfect teeth throughout our entire lives. He was hired by the United Fruit Company and the CIA to convince the American people that the Guatemalan Revolution was the most normal thing in the world. He worked for General Electric, he worked for Procter & Gamble, and he molded the ideas of the American people throughout the 90 years that he was here. Now, we are told that the American people are among the healthiest in the world. And we are certainly living longer than we did in past generations, but today there's an increase in allergies among our people. There's an increase in Alzheimer's disease. There's an increase in antibiotic resistance. There's an increase in asthma and autism. 1 in every 6 children in America has either a neurodevelopmental abnormality or a behavioral abnormality. At one time, the incidence of autism was 1 in 10,000. Now it's about 1 in 166 American children. Why is that happening? We find an increasing number of autoimmune diseases of all different sorts. There's an increase in cancer and in diabetes and in heart disease and in neurodegenerative diseases and Parkinson's disease. There's an increased obesity, and you've heard about the obesity epidemic, and how often do you watch television? They tell you about the obesity epidemic, and what you need is more in the way of exercise. That's going to solve your problem. And then there are the deadly new diseases, like AIDS and like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. These didn't exist when I went to medical school. There's a decreased fertility among our men. In fact, the sperm count in American men has fallen to about half of what it was a generation ago. And then we see Ebola and Lyme disease, and we see SARS and Nipah, which is another epidemic. And now we find about the avian flu epidemic that is threatening to annihilate us. And night after night, week after week, on television, in the newspapers, on radio, we see articles about the avian flu pandemic, which it's not may occur, but it's going to occur. It's only a matter of time. And you know that 55 people have died in the last 2.5 to 3 years of this disease. It's going to annihilate us all. And 55, I think the last count was 58 people have died. Did you ever have a thought in your mind that perhaps your minds were being molded, your tastes suggested, your ideas formed by people you really didn't know? Well, San Jose Mercury News reported on the 5th of October of last year, page A1, The title of the article was Immigrant Youth's Health Deteriorates in U.S. Study Finds, and this is what it says. And it's talking about foreign children coming to the United States. When they arrive, children of immigrants have lower rates of asthma and obesity than American-born children. Children born to immigrant mothers are also less likely to have low birth weights or die as an infant than children born to native-born mothers.